webinar. My name is Brooke Meyer. I'm the director of the Institute for Coordinated Community Response, and I'm so thrilled that you're here for Transgender Survivors, a roadmap through rural and urban communities to improve services and advocacy. Let's start with a few housekeeping items before we begin. All participants have been muted upon entry, so please interact in the chat box. If you want all attendees to see your messages, be sure that you change that little blue box from panelists to panelists and attendees. If you have questions for Michael throughout the webinar, you can ask those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can ask questions throughout the webinar, but we will hold them for a Q&A time at the end. If you have any technical difficulties, in that case, you would select all panelists and one of ICCR staff will assist. Before we begin, we have some new folks on with us today, so I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about who we are. The Institute for Coordinated Community Response was created in 2018 as a program of the National Conference on Crimes Against Women. ICCR is a training and technical assistance program that works with law enforcement, prosecutors, and advocates in rural Texas counties who are seeking to improve their community's systemic response to domestic violence. We know that 1 in 3 women in Texas will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime, which is higher than the national average. And women in rural communities are often in even more danger due to geographic isolation, lack of resources, lack of anonymity, and other barriers to seeking help that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. Recognizing that rural Texas does have often the most need and the least access to training and resources, ICCR selects teams from several counties each year for a full 12 months of training, resources, networking opportunities, and technical assistance to create and sustain a coordinated community response to domestic violence, to create greater justice for victims while holding offenders accountable. So while our program is geared towards rural needs and focused around the needs of the teams we work with each year, through webinars like this one, we're able to train practitioners from anywhere across the state and even outside of Texas who are committed to eradicating domestic violence in their communities, and all at no cost thanks to the generous support of the Caruth Foundation and the Moody Foundation. So thank you for being concerned with domestic violence in your community and for being here with us today. You can learn more about ICCR on our website, instituteccr.org, and I encourage you to sign up for our monthly newsletter there to stay in the loop about all of the great trainings that we provide for free throughout the year. So speaking of trainings, we have a few upcoming trainings you won't want to miss. Again, you can visit our website and go to upcoming events to learn more about these and register. In July, we will have John Wilkinson from Equitas joining us to discuss investigating and prosecuting high-risk cases of domestic violence and sexual assault. And at the end of July, we will hold our next bi-monthly Rural Texas Advocates Call. These calls are open to any advocates, community-based or systems-based across the state who serve rural survivors for networking and peer support and education. All right, now without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's presenter. Michael Munson is the co-founder and executive director of Forge, an organization focused on improving the lives of transgender individuals by building stronger connections, providing resources, and empowering growth through knowledge. Forge is a national training and technical assistance provider funded through the Department of Justice, Office on Violence Against Women, and the Office for Victims of Crime. Michael's educational background is in psychology, with an emphasis on trauma-informed care and non-traditional healing modalities. His work on violence against transgender and non-binary individuals stresses the intersectionality between complex components of identity, experience, and societal constructs that can spur violence, as well as catalyze healing for individuals and communities. He's passionate about engaging professionals to embrace these complexities and learn key skills to better serve their clients. Michael, please take it away.
Thanks, Brooke. And I am really excited to be with you all today this afternoon. I think we're in the same time zone for most of us, so that's always really exciting as well. So like Brooke said, I am Michael Munson. I'm with Forge, and we're going to have a really full hour and a half today talking about trans survivors and kind of the roadmap through improving services both in urban and in rural areas. So our agenda for the day is to have a brief recap of who Forge is, just so that you all have a rough idea of what we can offer you both today and going forward. We'll have a very short Trans 101, just so that we can all be on the same page about who trans folks are and who we're going to be talking about when we move on to talk about victimization data. We will look at the triple pandemic and the impact of that set of pandemics on survivors, obviously particularly trans survivors, and we'll also look at the impact of rural trans survivors and the pandemic as well. So lots of intersections there. We'll spend a bit of time looking at some barriers to accessing care for trans survivors, and then we'll wrap up today with what you can do, with some time for questions at the end, hopefully. If any of you have been on a Forge webinar or in one of our workshops at conferences or any place that we've presented, you have likely seen this slide. And if you haven't, now you have seen it. So I want to remind all of us to take care of ourselves today, and that might mean stepping out for a minute. It might be getting a drink of water, stretching, moving around, whatever it is that you need to do. Please take care of yourself as we spend the time together. And that can also mean that if you would like to participate through some of the brainstorms that we're going to have, that's great. If you don't want to, that's great as well. Let me give you a snapshot of who Forge is, just to kind of lay the framework a little bit. We are a 27-year-old anti-violence organization that is 100% trans focused. So trans, anti-violence, both of them together is what we do and who we are. About 75% of our time is spent doing training and technical assistance, so with providers like you all, and about 25% of our time is doing direct services. We have some services that are here in Wisconsin, where I live, but almost all of our services are national. To give you a better feel about the work that we do with providers, training and technical assistance can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. So for us, it means doing that one-on-one communication when people have a challenge or concern. It means creating publications, trainings like this, webinars like this, going to conferences when we can go and be together in person, which I know many of us are missing, that in-person connection. We've figured out how to do site visits remotely, which is really fantastic. And we also are involved with policy so that things can change on a more systemic level. And we really like working with partners to try to advance the field more through their connections and our mutual connections. The national work that we do with survivors is, because it's national, it's basically all online. And all of us are really good at this now during the pandemic, but we were doing online work with survivors for the past many, many, many years. So again, work with survivors includes publications, conferences, trainings, empowerment-based activities of lots of different kinds to work with survivors to increase their healing and their resilience. The two guiding principles that we have are to be trauma-informed, which is always a challenge to keep up on what does that mean. And we care about that both when we're working with survivors and also when we're working with providers. Same is true for empowerment-based. I think a lot of times we all think about empowering survivors, but I care as a trainer to really make sure that you feel empowered. So if you don't feel empowered, by the end of today, I have not done my job, and you can tell me about that. So those are our two guiding principles. Because all of us are generally connected on social media through our organizations or personally, I just wanted to share with you that our four primary platforms are Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. So new things that are coming out that are related to trans and victimization stuff, especially if it's produced by us, will get put out on one of those channels. So we'd like to be friends with you. You can be friends with us, all of that good, happy stuff. We do have a really small staff and a large vision. So we try to put out a lot of work with the small person power that we have. So how we're going to interact today, you've already heard some of that, is through chat or the Q&A box. I will, let's practice. Can folks find the chat, which I know many of you already have, and can you share your pronoun or pronouns? So for folks that may not know what that means, generally people would put in he, him, and his, or she, her, hers, or they, them, theirs. Excellent. People are finding it. Excellent. Perfect. I'm going to let you keep going with that. It's good practice for us to all share our pronouns if you're not in the regular habit of doing it. And this is one of those easy ways that it's pretty non-threatening to share your pronouns. Excellent. Thank you all for continuing to share your pronouns. The other way that we're going to interact today is through a Google Draw document. So if you have access to your web browser, we'll get to it at the very end of today, where we're going to do a mind map, and we'll all collectively be part of making something kind of cool. So let's talk next about these kind of brief Trans 101 reminders. This is one of my favorite quotes from Lynn Fraser, who said that no one's identity is a disorder. So a lot of times, some people think that being trans is a disorder. It's a mental health condition. It still is in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but it's not a disorder to be trans. And it's one of those things that I think it's important to remind folks of, that any of our identities are not a disorder. You'll all have access to a handout, and maybe AJ can put it in the chat as well. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to briefly go over this handout, which is a fantastic handout, really 101 basic concepts. And let me just review some of those pieces to it now. So the main components of the handout talk about these 4 different concepts. So one is sex assigned at birth. So we are almost always assigned a sex at birth. It's usually done by a physician who literally visually looks at us and decides, normally based on our genitals, if we're going to put if they're going to put an M or an F on our birth certificate. That sex assigned at birth is not always what somebody identifies in terms of their gender as they go through childhood and adulthood. So gender identity is that, what is that internal sense of someone's gender? So a lot of times it's male or female, and sometimes for trans folks, it might be non-binary or trans or agender, many, many different words that people might use to talk about their internal sense of gender. Again, we all have a gender identity. For a lot of folks, the majority of folks, it's male or female, but there are folks that are trans who their gender identity is something other than those 2 things. Gender expression is how people express their gender through clothing, through hairstyle, through accessories, jewelry, makeup, watches, all of those things that we kind of push out into the world. It's how people see us and how we want people to see us. Those 2 might not be the same, but it's really about that exchange of what goes out into the world versus what's on the inside. The 4th piece of this handout is around sexual or romantic orientation, and that's about who we're attracted to. Again, everybody has a sexual orientation, even if we're non-sexual. We all usually have somebody that we are attracted to or not attracted to. And those things are separate from gender identity and expression. So that is the quick 101 about that handout. I encourage folks to look at it. It's a great short handout. So if folks can type in the chat, what percentage do you think the population is that is transgender? That was bad grammar. What percentage of the population is transgender? What do you think? So any place between 0% and 100%. 5% I'm seeing. 3%, 25, 10, 5, 4, 10, don't know, great. So lots of different answers from really small to up to like 25%. Excellent. So good answers, right? All good answers. And the really cool thing is that we don't know what the answer is. So all of you are right. All of us could be wrong too, but I'm going to go with all of us are right. So Williams Institute is out of UCLA, and they have a fairly narrow, I believe, definition of who's trans. And they say it's under 1%. Other researchers like Lynn Conway say that it's more like 1% of the population is trans. We tend to go with that number because we have a broad view of who is trans. When we break that down some, so we take that 1% of the population that's trans, when we look at the breakdown, and I'm sorry, some of this didn't show up on the slide. That's very strange. So 29% roughly are transgender men, so people that were assigned female at birth who are now living in male or masculine roles. 31% are trans feminine or trans women. And the important part for those of us who work in sexual assault and domestic violence is that 35%, so the largest piece of the pie, identify as non-binary. So what that means in practice is that, you know, if we have sex segregated services, if we offer women's only shelter or a men's support group, that is going to exclude that biggest piece of the transgender pie. We also know this goes back to the guessing that you were making about how many people are trans. We also know that there's a growing number of people who are identifying as trans or who are verbally or outwardly stating that they're trans. We see this most in youth because that's who we're kind of tracking in terms of research. So right now in things like the YRBS, which I can never remember what it stands for, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, we're seeing rates of like 1.8% of youth that identify as transgender. Some cities are saying that their scores are up to 9.2% that identify as transgender. So again, all of you were correct in that number because the population is growing in terms of how people identify their gender and the more fluid they're becoming in their gender identity. So if we take 1% of the population is trans, if we look at the total population of the state of Texas, which Google tells me is 29 million, 1% of that is 290,000. So that's how many trans people are walking around or rolling around in Texas. Just a reminder, and this should be something that I hope that all of you are thinking about and know about, but trans people live in rural communities as well as in cities. Trans people are everywhere, everywhere across the country, everywhere across the state. Rural, urban, middle, suburbs, everywhere. And there are a million ways to be trans. So people may medically transition or not, legally change their name or their gender or not, socially transition or not. People might be binary or non-binary, out or not out, lots and lots of different ways. So I want to encourage you today as we talk about things to realize that there is a number of ways to be trans as there are trans people. Let's talk a little bit about language and why language matters so much. I've oftentimes done this kind of word cloud, and people have said, well, how many words are there that mean the same thing as trans or that are trans identities? So it's unreadable on your screen, I know, but there's 100 different words, identity words, that are related to trans issues that are on that little word cloud. The important things to remember, though, is that language is always evolving. Not just about trans things, language is evolving for everything. And language can be really complicated. It can feel complicated, and it can also be really, really simple. And I guarantee you that it's oftentimes messy. We're all gonna mess up sometimes in language, trans language or other language, and it's okay. We can say it's messy, it's complicated, I will try to do better. So some of you, I'm over 50, so I know that folks that are over 50 would likely know that this is the abominable snowman with Bugs Bunny, who is being totally non-consensually squeezed in the abominable snowman's arms. And the abominable snowman says, I will hug him and pet him and squeeze him and call him George. So I want to remind us with this cartoon that we don't call everybody George. Right? I don't go around and introduce and say, hi, you're George, I'm going to call you George. We also don't know what anybody's pronoun is. So we want to ask people what their name is, so we don't call them George. We want to ask them what their pronoun is so that we will know what their pronoun is, because otherwise we won't know just based on looking at them or based on the tone of their voice or any other attribute. So a lot of agencies have made posters. This is a great one that I really love. And it says, we respect each other's pronouns because we respect each other. Can you do the same? And pronouns matter for a lot of different reasons. It shows respect for one thing, but it also dramatically reduces rates of suicide attempt, rates of suicide thought, changes in people's feelings of depression. So it's not just about a simple 2 or 3 or 4 letter word, those pronouns. It's about actually allowing people to live and thrive as real people, as whole selves. I want to play a video for you that shares a little bit more about pronouns before we move into victimization stats. I will warn you that this is, it generally is a little bit soft to hear, so if you want to turn up your volume, that may help.
Pronoun. You can call me he, you can call me she, you can call me Regis and Kathy Lee.
Simple. Pronouns are not hard, but people's understanding of them apparently is.
Simple. Simple. You know, I just feel like I'm not stabbing myself in the leg every 7 days with testosterone for them to call me she.
Respect. I think it's always important to ask someone what they use, what honors them, and to use that.
Gender, the way people look, isn't necessarily descriptive of who they are inside.
Difficult. As someone who considers themselves non-binary, I have a lot of trouble interacting with people who've never interacted with someone who uses they, them pronouns.
When people hear that I use he, she, and they pronouns, I think they get a little bit nervous, because what if they start using one pronoun and then they say a different pronoun in the next sentence? Then everyone will think they messed up.
He, she, it, they, it's just a word. I don't like it when people call me a he. I feel like they need to be corrected right on the spot.
When someone knows about my fluidity and chooses a pronoun that resonates well with me in that moment, yay.
Key to educate oneself about who you let into your life and how they want to be identified.
Useful. If anything, I'd be more hung up on the need some people feel to attach preferred. That could give people an inaccurate idea of what being trans is, because my pronouns aren't preferred, they just are, because my gender's not, you know, a desire that I have or like a wish or something. It's who I am. It's just part of me.
Useful. I mean, it's easier to talk to somebody when they know how to address you.
Feel good about pronouns. It feels great to have the ability to choose your own pronouns.
Constant. That is a thing that I constantly have to fight for. All my friends and family are on board, so I don't have to worry so much. But I always worry about what pronouns strangers are using for me in their heads, which is really just a silly thing I should not even be thinking about.
Individuality. Given they might not know how to address you unless you tell them, or if they ask and you answer them.
I would say patience is the word I think of. When somebody uses my pronoun, I don't get angry, I just re-correct them and help them really understand, the importance of how misusing somebody's pronoun can be offensive.
Identity, and you better get it right. In the workplace, people who persistently misgender you are actually guilty of sexual harassment. So what's more important, how you see me or respecting how I see me?
So it's a lovely video. I think that's really simple, and it reminds us of some of those things. I see some of the things that are coming in the chat, and I'm gonna flip back to them a little bit later, if that's okay. I'd like to share with you some data first, and then we'll take a little bit of time for some questions. So I'm going to kind of go from early on through adulthood. So when we look at what is happening to trans kids in grades K through 12, we know that a lot of kids are getting expelled or leaving school due to violence. So if you add up the 6% and the 17%, it's 23%. And that oftentimes means that they're not going back to school. They're out of school. They may be out of their house as well. And they're not going to finish high school. They're not going to get a GED. They're not going to get a diploma. And I think a lot of us know that what happens to people that don't finish school is that they end up on the streets. They end up working street economies. They may have more challenges with law enforcement. So that school to prison pipeline starts with things like getting expelled or kicked out of school because of whatever reason. And for a lot of trans people, it's because they're trans. Trans people are also, both as youth and as adult, denied access to public restrooms. And this may not seem like a big deal, but if you need to use the bathroom and you get denied, it's both an emotionally taxing thing as well as it's a physically taxing thing. We know that trans folks are having more things like urinary tract infections and kidney disease because they're being denied access to restrooms. That's at school, at work, in public. So the stat that you probably care most about in our time today are the rates of sexual violence and intimate partner violence. So within trans communities, it's roughly 1 in 2 that experience intimate partner violence. That is fairly well cited across the board that it's 1 in 2. sexual violence is a little bit less firm in terms of what the data shows us. And we have some surveys that are like 50%, others are more like 66% most of the time. And then within some subpopulations of the trans community, that number is even higher. So a substantial number of trans people have experienced sexual violence or intimate partner violence. When we do the math again, when we take the population of Texas, we look at 1% is trans, and then we look at 50% have experienced IPV, 66% have experienced sexual assault. That's someplace between 159,000 trans people and 191,000 trans people who have experienced either or both sexual assault or intimate partner violence. So if you're not seeing in your agency trans people, it's not because they don't exist. It's not because they aren't experiencing victimization. It's because of some other reason that they're not coming in through your doors. And we're going to talk about why that might be. Wanted to share a little bit more data about accessing healthcare. So this is a profound statistic that 10% of trans people have experienced sexual assault by a healthcare provider. So that's 1 in 10 that have experienced sexual assault by a healthcare provider. 1 in 4 have experienced physical assault by a healthcare provider. So if this person has already experienced sexual assault in a healthcare setting, if they're sexually assaulted outside of a healthcare setting, are they going to want to go for a forensic exam, for example? Are they going to want to go have their arm set if their arm was broken? It's not likely that they will want to seek medical care. So when we look at just plain denial of medical care, it's 19%. So those are the folks that can't even get in the door and won't be experiencing sexual violence from the provider because they can't even get to see their provider. We also know that trans folks are experiencing negative interactions with police. And right now in our culture, we're hearing a lot more about what's going on with police. And I know that there's probably a lot of law enforcement on today. So I want to be really clear that, I know, and I think we all know that there are great law enforcement officers that would never treat people with disrespect, but there are some that do. And so what trans people are hearing more and more often in those interactions are hearing things like the wrong pronoun or being asked invasive questions. Sexual assault and physical assault can obviously happen by anybody against anybody. But a lot of times the disrespectful feelings are coming by law enforcement not using name of use, pronouns, forms of address that feel respectful to that person. So a couple of rural implications is that I think that sometimes when law enforcement work in rural communities, there are just fewer law enforcement officers that have a wider range of scope that they're serving. And as a result, there can be, less training possibly, and fewer officers might have more interactions with folks that they don't necessarily understand about that culture or that population. When we look at homelessness, and I'm bringing up homelessness not because it's not directly related to sexual assault and intimate partner violence, but it's very related. So at some point in trans people's lives, when we look at a big group of trans people, 30% have experienced homelessness. For those who want to or need to seek shelter because they're homeless, 26% of them have avoided shelter out of fear of mistreatment. And that's a right fear because people have experienced a lot of violence when they've entered shelter. So 7 out of 10 who did seek shelter, who went to shelter, were mistreated. A lot of times what that means is that somebody stays one night, they were mistreated badly enough that they do not stay at that shelter. So the street economy is another piece of what we talked about. So the kids that drop out of school, that get expelled from school, the folks that are in intimate violence relationships that end up needing to leave home on the street, can't get into a homeless shelter, can't get into a DV shelter. A lot of times folks will end up working the street economy. And that may include sex work, it may include selling drugs, it may include any way for that person to survive and be able to have some food in their belly and hopefully a roof over their head. Of those folks that are working in the street economy, it's no surprise that there's more interaction with law enforcement, because that's just how it works when people are on the streets doing sex work or doing other sales. But more and more trans folks report being harassed or attacked or sexually assaulted or mistreated by law enforcement when they're working in that environment. So it's kind of no wonder that there's more alcohol and drug use among folks that have been multiply marginalized and multiply victimized. So if we look at the general US population, around 7% use drugs and alcohol for coping in probably some unhealthy ways. When we look at the trans community, it's 4 or 5 times that. When we look at trans community and people who have experienced IPV, for example, that rate is up to 70% that are using drugs and alcohol. So there's a direct relationship from victimization to using drugs and alcohol. And the same can be said about suicide attempts. So again, if we look at general population, it's roughly about 5% of the general population who attempt suicide. When we look at trans respondents to, again, really large survey samples, it's 40%, 40%, who have attempted suicide. Not thought about, but attempted. This is a profound number. It's a number that should hopefully shock us because it's so high. But just to give you an idea that, like this is something that somebody's coming in with. They may not be actively suicidal right now, but it's what they bring with them when they're starting to seek services from you. Just a quick note on the gender vector. So I think a lot of times in our culture, we think about women as being disproportionately affected by childhood sexual abuse, adult sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and stalking. Within trans communities, when we look at folks that are trans feminine or trans masculine, you can see that those bar graphs are almost the same depending, based on those vectors. So it's really important for us to think about trans folks, not in terms of like, oh, trans women are being assaulted more often than trans men, because that's not what data bears out to be true. One last data slide for us to talk about is the rate of polyvictimization. So this is from a study that we did about 10 years ago, and we were surprised to see how many people had kind of checked off the box for more than one type of victimization. So for example, 64% of people who experience childhood sexual assault also experience stalking. So again, just a reminder of when somebody's coming into your office, it is likely that they've previously experienced another form of victimization. And of course, I think a lot of us are well aware right now of how many intersections there are and how many interconnectednesses there are between different types of identities, different types of marginalization. So folks of color might experience higher rates of violence. People who are not US citizens may experience different challenges with law enforcement. Lots of different things can play a role in what victimization looks like and what services might be able to be accessed. So let's look at the triple pandemic. So that was a lot of data. Hopefully, if you need to shake it out, you can get a drink of water if you need to. And let's talk about the triple pandemic. So I think most of us have traditionally looked at a triple pandemic as COVID-19 as number one, the economic situation related to COVID-19 as number two, and then the big changes that have happened with the awareness of racism. So racism hasn't necessarily changed, but our cultural awareness has. And so all of those three things are three fairly commonly identified pandemics. Many of them are still going. I think all three of them are still pretty hot right now. I would like to suggest that there are two additional pandemics that are on top of it. So one of them is legislated hate. So the laws and the policies that are being enacted that are anti-trans, anti-immigration, anti-reproductive rights, all of the things that are affecting people's lives that are legislated generally out of a hate-motivated reason. So some of those things may not be out of a hate-motivated reason. And the other thing that lays on top of both of the, all of those things is sanctioned hate. So it's when we see or hear leaders say things that give kind of permission to other people to say, oh, they acted like this, so I guess it's okay. I can act like this too. And so when it's around hate, when we see hate speech from people in power, other people think, oh, that's okay. I can say those words too. I can be hateful as well. So I think we've got those 5 pandemics that are operating at the same time, and they overlap and they're interconnected, but there's 5 of them, not 3 of them. So this is a non-scientific graph. I will be really clear, it's not scientific. We saw in our country a lot of protections being added for LGBT folks. That started around 2009, a little bit before then, and it really peaked around 2016. So that peak, you can figure out what was going on in the world. But around 2016, 2017, we started to see a decline in the amount of LGBTQ protections that were offered on the federal level, the state level, the local level. And at this point in time, we're in 2021, we don't really know where some of it's going, because we see some things that are increasing in protection again, we see some things that are decreasing in protection, and we see some kind of steady going forward. So I think all of us need to be part of the solution on that, of determining where we want that to go. And I hope that most of you will want to try to increase protections for LGBTQ folks, particularly trans folks. So this is a nonpartisan slide. I really want to be clear that I'm not trying to be partisan, but under the years of the Trump administration, there were an extremely high amount of anti-trans and anti-LGBT legislative actions that were taken, both through executive order and through other means. That's really different than what we're seeing now in this administration, where even in things like the presidential address to Congress, the president said the word transgender, and it was in a positive way. And it let the young people know that the president has their back. So it's just a really different attitude. Again, not partisan, just showing that there's a difference in who's in office and what messages that sends. So what's happening, what we're seeing is that the legislative efforts have moved from the federal level, and the anti-trans pieces are moving to the state level. So we're seeing more statewide initiatives, more local initiatives that are anti-trans, while the federal level is not really moving as much right now. So some of the rural implications for Texas in particular is that there's an overtly anti-trans governor in Texas, which obviously is going to have kind of that umbrella effect for all communities, rural communities, included. And a lot of times when smaller communities are involved, they will adopt whatever is the statewide law. So they may not do things like create their own codes or policies or municipal statements that may be a little bit in contradiction with what the statewide laws are. We also know that there may be things like youth playing sports. Maybe there's not enough even bandwidth in a smaller community to create more sporting opportunities for folks, even if the state law stays in place. If you'd like to learn more about anti-trans legislation, the Equality Federation has just a fantastic website, and they capture laws that are related to LGBT issues. They capture pro, neutral, and negative laws. Right now, Texas is fairly high in terms of the number of active bills that are in the state legislature, and 12 of them are quite aggressively anti-trans focused. So if you want to learn more about those HB bills, you can go and check them out. So let's look next at the current events and the cultural ramifications of those current events on trans survivors. So there's 6 of them that I'm going to talk with you about today. And the first one is about fear. And we are seeing so much pervasive fear from trans communities, particularly trans survivors. And the fear goes from, am I safe on the streets? Am I safe in my employment? Am I going to get fired? Do I have safe housing? If I even have housing. Can I use the bathroom? So 22% of trans folks can't use public restrooms. What is my relationship stability like? Are other people in my family, for example, anti-trans, and so I can't come home for the holidays anymore? What is it like in my relationships? And we're definitely seeing an increase in hate-motivated crimes. So across our country right now, we're seeing hate-motivated crimes increasing for folks that are Jewish, folks that are Asian American, folks that are Black, and folks that are trans or lesbian, gay, or bi. The second implication or result of the current events is this concept of mirroring. So if we watch the news, it doesn't matter what news you're watching, we will oftentimes hear leaders, whether they're political leaders, celebrity leaders, people in the position of authority, say things that are pretty horrific, racist, homophobic, transphobic, those kinds of things. And what is happening for folks that are in a violent relationship at home is that the offenders are picking up on that language and they're using it against their partners at home. So anti-trans slurs that are in the public eye are being brought back home. So that survivor at home is hearing it from their partner, they're hearing it from their TV or their media sources, they're hearing it all around them. What we know, though, is that, if we look at this, it's that emboldening and that sanctioning of those language pieces that are really making the difference. We're being told as a culture that these things are normal when they're not normal to be so negative and so hateful. So the Black Lives Matter movement and systemic racism, I know that was one of the pandemics, but it's also a challenge that folks are having as a current event. So because there's more visible police misconduct and violence, people are oftentimes scared to attend protests or attend rallies or do actions that are mobilizing against or for a cause. We're seeing a lot of folks that have increased safety concerns when they're out in groups of people or wanting to do political action around race or about any other issue. So just again, that there's some ways that communities are protecting folks who are multiply marginalized, but it's another way that the current events are affecting folks. Again, COVID-19 was listed as a pandemic, but right now I want to talk about the isolation that comes from it and the increased abuse. So most of us, I think, have a recognition that with lockdown, and I know Texas is more opened up than some other states, but with lockdown, a lot of us saw an increase in intimate partner violence because people were forced to be at home. And oftentimes that was forced to be at home with their partner who was abusive, a parent who might have been abusive, somebody else in their household that was abusive. We also were seeing within trans communities and probably elsewhere that there was an increase in financial dependence or other strings that were attached. So if one of the people in the household lost their job due to COVID, everybody else was dependent on the person that did have a job. So it was another way to exert power that was caused by the emergence of the pandemic. So one of the rural implications might be that isolation might be a little bit harder. So if somebody is isolating because of COVID, it may be harder to find some escape hatches if you're living in a rural community. There may not be a place to go safely that is a place of refuge or just not away from your partner or your household. The other piece of this is around vaccination. And again, Texas is very open in terms of lack of restrictions right now, but is also not highly vaccinated. So people may be still concerned about going out in public or avoiding their home, getting out of their home and out of the abuse because they're worried about COVID-19 if they've not been vaccinated. We also know in rural communities that there are fewer access points to get vaccinated. So there's a lot of different things that can happen, and rural communities may be a little bit more conservative, maybe, and may have different attitudes about wanting to get vaccinated. So a fifth piece of the current events are around instability. So I think a lot of us have felt really jostled by the last year and a half. But for trans folks, with the legislative pieces, with all of these pieces playing together, a lot of folks feel that they can't get their footing. And a lot of people have taken actions that they weren't really ready to take or they didn't necessarily want to take, but they were worried that if they didn't take it now, they would lose their chance. So some of those examples are around, I need to change my name right now because I'm worried that some law is going to change that won't allow me to later. So people are making actions, usually around legal or medical choices, that they wouldn't necessarily have made if they didn't feel that external pressure. You saw already that there's a lot of depression and suicidality within trans communities to begin with. All of us who have been locked down for a long time and have gone through this pandemic have realized that they're feeling even more depressed and anxious and suicidal. So those rates are going even higher than they already were for trans folks. And a lot of folks are really hanging on to anything because the world feels so unstable. And that oftentimes means hanging on to their abusive partner. So one of the rural implications for this is because the laws are so rapidly changing, there might be concerns about, can I even access basic health care? Even if I did want to make some changes, in my health decisions. Can I access outlets like sports, where there's a lot of legislation right now going on about trans girls in sports and team sports in grade school, high school, middle school. So there's a lot of things like that that may not be available to folks or may be challenged by legislative action for folks that are in rural communities. People might also be challenged by the fact that some communities are really against doing a positive trans-inclusive education or LGBT-inclusive education in schools. So people may not be getting some of the skills and knowledge that they need. And the last coping strategy that I wanted to share with you, the last current event strategy is around coping. And again, I shared with you some stats around drugs and alcohol, which are substantially higher already for trans people. One of the ways that people are coping with these multiple pandemics is to use drugs and alcohol. It is I don't want to say it's a viable coping strategy, but it is a coping strategy that many people use. People are also choosing to isolate. So not isolating because of COVID, but choosing to isolate because the world has felt harder. The world has felt more discriminatory. So people are choosing to stay home, choosing to not see their friends, not Zoom with their friends, but just really pulling in. Kind of on the other side of that, we're seeing increased risk taking. So people who are not masking, who are not so concerned about COVID, not so concerned about if they drive fast, if they engage in unprotected sex, just lots of risk taking in lots of different areas. We are also seeing this pairing of the hierarchy of who has it worse within trans communities. So if I experience this, I've had it worse than you, and all of these jockeying places so that people can say who's more marginalized, who's more victimized. And that goes hand in hand with the horizontal hostility. So the tensions that are happening within trans communities themselves. The last two pieces are, I think, really substantial and really deserve a lot of time, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. One is about detransitioning. I want to be super, super clear that there's absolutely nothing wrong with somebody having transition genders to a new and affirmed gender, and then deciding that they would like to transition back to their sex assigned at birth. There's nothing wrong with that. But what we're seeing in these pandemics is that people are transitioning back because they feel it will be safer for them. And so that detransitioning is not about who their identity is and who they are as a person. It's about how can I feel more safe in the world? And that safety piece goes to weapons. So again, nonpartisan statement here, but we have seen across our country a dramatic increase in weapon sales. And we're seeing that particularly in trans communities as well, of if the laws aren't going to protect me, I'm going to protect myself. If my neighbors are against who I am as a trans person, I'm going to protect myself from them. So we're seeing a lot of weapons purchasing and weapons use. And those of us who work in IPV know that when there's a weapon in the house, it's much more likely that somebody is going to get killed, homicide or suicide. So some rural implications can really be around, there are fewer places to seek support. So that coping strategy of using alcohol and drugs might be because, there aren't therapists or support groups that are nearby in rural communities. There might also be one agency that does a whole bunch of different victim-related things or non-victim-related things, and it may be challenging to access services that are specific and focused on what that person's needs are. And there's obviously some concerns around that kind of dual relationships that people might have in rural communities. They know the person that's working at the sexual assault related facility. Everybody knows everybody's business. So that's some of the challenges that trans folks have when looking at how do I find other coping mechanisms and how can I get support. That second piece that I mentioned was around guns. So I know in Texas right now, there's been some pretty dramatic changes in who can access weapons, what kind of permits are necessary, and how easy it is to access them. So this is not just rural, but it's rural and urban. And I think that just, again, it plays a role in how many homicides may happen as a result of that mix between access to weapons, weapons in the home, and IPV on top of it. So how does this all relate to sexual assault, intimate partner violence? Hopefully you've seen the threads of that going through what we've talked about. Just kind of putting it in some different language. We see that there are microaggressions and there's some macroaggressions. We see that there's minority stress. So a lot of people are feeling just weighted down by the world. We see that there are health disparities as a result of trauma. We see that there is lower self-esteem as a result of the world being a harsh place and people kind of knocking others down a peg. We see higher risk-taking behaviors across the board. And we see a lesser likelihood of seeking help. And all of that put together increases the likelihood of encountering abuse, whether it's at school, at home, on the streets, at work. So let's shift and talk about barriers to accessing services. So I'd like to start again with folks sharing in the chat. If you could just think for a moment about what the barriers you think are for trans people who may want to access victim services. So I encourage you to think broadly about, all of the different kinds of disciplines that you're representing. So what are some of the barriers that trans people face in accessing services? You don't need to be shy either. If you can do it in the chat, that would be a really easy place for all of us to see. So advocate attitudes and stigma, great. Shelters for DV only for women. Many shelters or safe houses are faith-based, yep. Feeling unsafe outing themselves. Lack of education and acceptance of trans issues. Single-sex services, yep. Being identified by their birth gender. Our mission statement excludes non-binary or gender fluid, that's interesting. Legal matters towards their pronouns, stigma and ignorance, language access, accommodations. Yeah, those are all great things. Y'all can keep on generating some of those. Those are all great things. And I'm gonna share with you some of the things that we've seen as well. So I'm seeing more, so not having appropriate support services. Many services are grant funded for specific gendered violence, which is interesting. We'll talk a little bit about that too, about grant programs and requirements or grant programs that don't have requirements. Really good list, folks. Thank you for sharing. So when we look at the issues that people who are trans have brought up in both research and in anecdotal stories, through what we've learned from providers, what we've learned directly from trans survivors, these are 10 top concerns that I'll share with you. I'm going to be fairly brief about these things. Most of them are pretty self-evident. So number one top concern is, will I be turned away? Can I even get in the door of a victim service agency? A second one is, will I be safe? So not just will I be safe from my abuser, but will I be safe from other clients, from staff, from victim service providers who may not be with the staff that I'm working with, in the neighborhood, or in how to get to that service provider. So I always want to be careful that I'm not saying that a neighborhood is unsafe or not, but if a trans person needs to take public transportation to get to somebody's agency, are they going to feel safe taking public transportation? Are they going to feel safe walking from the bus corner to where the agency is? Will that process be safe in order to get there? And then when they get in the door, will they be safe? A third concern is, will staff know about and be sensitive to me as a trans person? So is there training and knowledge that staff have had so that they can be sensitive, respectful, knowledgeable, or at least knowledgeable enough about trans folks? A fourth one is about identity documents. So my identity documents don't align with the gender I live in. Will I be denied services, discriminated against, or harassed? So these are for services that, when people need to show ID, if that ID doesn't match what that person looks like or the name that they share with you that they use, some agencies are saying, you're not who you say you are. You can't have services here, or your documentation needs to align in order to get services here. So people are concerned about it, and there's some, realism to that concern as well. So a fifth concern is about, will I be misgendered? So misgendering can come in lots of different ways. It can come in not using somebody's name or their pronoun. It can come by making kind of inferences about how somebody's dressed, how somebody's behaving, lots of different ways that can play out. But it's usually around name and pronoun. A sixth trans-specific concern is, will someone out me? do I have agency over my story and my life? So somebody mentioned that in the chat. A lot of these have been mentioned in the chat about, do I have control over when I tell somebody or if I tell somebody that I have a trans history? And a lot of times providers think they're being helpful if they share that somebody is trans with other providers in that agency or share that information with other clients. And we really want to work on empowering survivors to tell their own story, including whether or not they want to tell the piece of their story that might be their trans history. A seventh concern is about, will I have privacy? Will I have ample privacy? And this is more related to folks who are in residential shelter or in other forms of shelter where people are living together. And it's oftentimes about, do I share a bedroom with somebody? Do I have to shower in like a publicly accessed shower that maybe more than one person accesses at a time? Will I be able to, like for trans women who wear wigs, well, how am I going to, sleep at night if I wear a wig and my roommate doesn't know that I'm trans? So all of those things kind of add together. Somebody uses hormones and the facility says, well, we manage everybody's meds. Well, that means that trans person has to go and the agency knows that they're trans because they're getting their hormones there. So again, all of those are pieces of privacy. Number 8 is, will I have to report my abuse to law enforcement? Because so many trans people, especially trans people of color, have had negative interactions with law enforcement, there's a lot of hesitance of coming forward and feeling like if I want to get services, I have to talk to law enforcement. So those of us specifically who are working in sexual assault, more so than IPV, know things like you can get a forensic exam and medical care without reporting to law enforcement. And those are the kinds of things that we need to be able to share with our clients so that they can make a choice of like, yes, I do want to get care, but I'm not ready to talk to law enforcement. Not now, maybe not ever, but giving people that choice. A 9th concern is around, aren't these services just for women? So if I don't identify as a woman, what does it mean about what happened to me? So we hear a lot of times from trans men, especially those who transitioned, and they say, well, I transitioned and well, sexual assault doesn't happen to men. Intimate partner violence doesn't happen to men. And that's not true. And a lot of people then think about the services because of where the movement, the feminist movement and the sexual violence movement kind of emerged out of a women's-based, environment. People don't always know that there are now services that will serve all genders of people. And the 10th and last thing that I'll share with you about trans people's concerns is this concept of I'm ashamed about and embarrassed about what happened to me in terms of victimization. Will staff make me feel ashamed about being trans on top of what happened to me? So again, that layering effect of shame and stigma on that person. So we're going to move next and talk about what all of us can do. And I'm going to share with you a couple things before we do some group activity. So what we're going to talk about are things that are micro-inclusions. So micro-inclusions are the exact opposite of a microaggression. So the micro-inclusion is a small step to include somebody. On a bigger scale, a micro-inclusion is kind of the symbolic action that forces us to recall the humanity of others. So these are like the little things that we can do that add up to make a huge difference. So we are going to do a mind map together, which will be fun. I promise you it will be fun. So if you have a QR code and you want to use it, the QR code's on the screen, or you can go to the URL that's on the screen. And if AJ, if you could flip that into the chat, I'd appreciate it. And I'm going to unshare my screen for a second, and we are going to create a beautiful map that's going to look kind of like this. So let me unshare and reshare my screen. So if you'd like to go to that URL, I will show you how this is going to play out. Oops, hang on a second. Oops, here we go. So what you all can do, and what I would love for you to do, is grab one of these boxes and start typing in what is something that you can do to improve services for trans survivors. So feel free to grab any box, make your own box if you want, change the color right away. Perfect. And we'll take about 5 minutes or so to just kind of let your juices get flowing and look around at what other people are writing. Way to go, folks. Really, really adding a lot. Excellent. And of course, you can move your boxes around. You can make them wider or taller. Let's keep going for a little bit longer. If you need some prompts, look around at what's been posted. You can extend off the edge of the screen. It's fine to add wherever you'd like to add something new. Let's take one more minute. And as you're finishing your thoughts that you're typing, please do look around at what other people have written and shared. This is really excellent, everybody. This is really fantastic. I'm loving looking at this, and I will make sure that I send out this version when hopefully all of it can get read. I will just adjust it a little bit and send it out to Brooke and AJ so that they can send it out to you if they can do that. I don't know if they're going to do that or not, but slides will come out to y'all. The unicorn will come out, and this will be made available to you as well. Excellent. Thank you so much for generating so many ideas and keeping that going. You can continue to add to this as I'm going to switch back to our PowerPoint slides, but you can continue adding or looking at it in your web browser if you'd like. And can I confirm that folks can see slides again? Actually, let me pop that.
Looks great.
Thank you very much. I never know what folks are able to see. So let me share with you all some ideas, many of them that you've already put on that mind map. And I know we all couldn't read all of that, what was there. So some of these may be duplicate, some of these may be new. So these are things that are free and easy to do, which kind of says that we can all do something to make the world better for trans survivors. So this is the obvious one, right? We can believe survivors. We can believe survivors whether they're trans or whether they're not trans. But it's just a good reminder. It's a great place to start. When we focus on the fact that survivors are survivors, we believe them, we can serve them better. And it really relates to the second piece, which is if we stay person-centered or issue-centered, we are going to do really well with our clients. So it doesn't matter if they're trans or not. It might matter to them. And then if it matters to them, it matters to your working relationship with them. But if we stay laser focused on what they need, what they want, we're going to be able to do a good job in serving them. We can use names and pronouns because pronouns do matter. Again, they reduce depression, anxiety, suicidality. They show respect. And there's a lot of ways that we can bring names and pronouns into our work. So we can introduce ourselves when we greet somebody with, hi, I'm Michael, and I use he, him, and his pronouns. And then that encourages them, you can say, hey, what name would you like me to call you? What pronouns would you like me to use? And it's awkward a little bit at first, but it gets easier over time. I tell people a lot, like, talk to your animals, talk to your plants. You can name all your plants, you can name all your animals and give them all a pronoun and practice at home. I can guarantee you that your plants won't care. Your cat might care. If you do it to your kids might really care, but practice. It'll make it easier when you're with a client and start introducing yourself with pronouns and name. Have accessible bathrooms. So a lot of agencies are small and they have a single stall bathroom. If there's a single stall bathroom, really easy to convert that to an all gender bathroom instead of having like two single stall bathrooms side by side. So really encourage you to, have all gender bathrooms. If that's not possible, if you're in a building, for example, that you can't do that, you can have appropriate signage, whether it's in your office or in the bathroom itself, that reminds folks that the people are in that bathroom are supposed to be there, right? People know which bathroom they belong in. And there's very, very, very rare occasions where somebody is being inappropriately using the wrong bathroom. Think about what your organizational culture is, and if that affirms things like allowing people to make the choice around what bathroom they use, which is pretty darn simple. And think about things like accompaniment. So this is oftentimes what happens if we're an advocate and we're going with somebody to court. And that court building has gendered bathrooms. And it's in a building that the survivor's not familiar with. We can say to them, hey, I would be happy to walk down the hallway with you if you need to use the restroom. I'll stand outside, you do your business, you come out, and we'll walk back to the courtroom or wherever it is that we're doing our stuff. And it sounds weird a little bit, it sounds a little creepy, but I guarantee you that it's not creepy to that trans person who wants to use the restroom before their court date, for example. So just literally offering to walk down with somebody to a restroom can be really, really empowering and allow them to clear their head and be ready for the services that they will receive. Folks can do things fairly simply like add to their social media. Many of us schedule our social media ahead of time. So like it's Pride Month right now. So your organization can schedule out Pride related or LGBT related posts on social media. So this is from NNEDV. A lot of agencies right now are posting many, many, many trans related and assault related bits and pieces on their social media. So this is a great time to go and see what other people are posting and borrow their concepts, use their concepts, and start adding to your own bank of social media posts. I wanted to offer a little bit of an interlude before we do the rest of the 10 things. And I'd like to play a video for you first, and then share a couple of things after it. So this video is not directly linked to sexual assault, domestic violence, but it's about trans youth and sports. And when we look at trans youth and sports, it really is about developing kids to have teamwork, to learn social skills, to have healthy relationship skills. So it really is related. Let me share this video with you. It's a really sweet and wonderful video.
I learned that practice pays off.
I learned the value of hard work.
I became a part of something bigger than myself.
I wasn't great in school, but baseball and eventually softball motivated me to really work hard.
I never played college ball. I never went pro. But through mushing, I got to be part of something.
I learned how to win and how to lose and how to keep going either way.
I grew stronger.
I grew more confident.
I met some of my best friends.
I had fun.
I treasured those memories. I hope all kids get the chance that I got.
I hope every kid in Wisconsin can be part of a team.
Trans inclusion is important to me. I coach kids in soccer that are gender fluid and non-binary. My kids are on their team, and those are just their teammates to them.
Let kids play, Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, deja a niños que jueguen.
Let kids play, Wisconsin.
Let kids play, Wisconsin.
Let kids play, Wisconsin.
Let kids play, Wisconsin.
I just want to play with my friends. Bye.
So in Wisconsin, like in Texas, there are anti-trans sports bills that are in the works. So I wanted to share two more parts to this. So video is one part. This note is a second part. So the note says, "Dear neighbor, I wanted to give you a big thank you for hanging a pride flag on your house. It truly gives me a sense of safety and pride in both the LGBTQIA+ community and in our city's community. Happy Pride." So this person, neighbor, gave this card, this really cute card, to the person that's hanging up the pride flag. And the people's house who had the pride flag are these two people that are on the screen right now. And the person with her back to us is Rachel Crowell, who made that video about let trans kids play. And the person facing us is Helen Boyd, who is an author on trans-related issues and has really led the way for some of the Wisconsin initiatives around the trans youth in sports and around a lot of things. So I thought it was just this really sweet thing that all of these things are coming together. And, again, it's a really simple thing to, hang a pride flag at your organization or in the window or wherever it is. And you won't know where it's going to make a difference until someone maybe tells you, or maybe somebody won't tell you. All right, if we go back to the simple and easy things to do, we can offer people alternatives to police. Again, not anti-police. Police work really well for some people, but for the folks that don't want to access police, we can offer some suggestions around how else people can seek justice through restorative justice, through harm reduction, through lots of different ways. So, think creatively about how we can advocate for people that may feel hesitant or resistant to working with law enforcement. A seventh thing that people can do is to be an upstander. So we can speak up or step up or call in when somebody makes an anti-trans comment or an anti-anything comment. We can make it be all about us rather than relying on that trans person to be the one that has to speak up when something happens. So all of us can do this in our own way. I mean, I know that I tend to be really shy and how I call in people is really different than how some other people might, but we can all step up a little bit and make a difference. The eighth thing that we can all do at some level is to get involved and show up. I know a lot of us on our agency time can't do political things, can't go to rallies, can't show up in those ways, but our agency might be able to sign on to letters that support some form of action or support some group of people. We may want to, on our own personal time, get involved and show up. One of the things that I wanted to share about this picture, this was also taken in Milwaukee. And one of the ways that our faith community showed up in Milwaukee is there were about 100 faith leaders that showed up, and they made a circle around those of us who were in the middle. And it was a rally, the speakers and all like that, but the faith community literally surrounded the people that were there for the rally to try to offer some protection. And it was one way that the faith community showed up and really offered something incredibly beautiful and wonderful for folks. And it made a lot of people feel a lot safer. Number 9 is about seeing and affirming resilience. A lot of times we see what's hard and what's going wrong for folks. Trans people oftentimes live challenging lives, not always, but often, with hearing lots of negative things, with living in a world that is not always accepting. So when we can see and affirm somebody's resilience, whether it's as simple as being kind of petty, but saying, wow, that is a beautiful dress you have on, or I love your bracelet, or, wow, I can see that you've worked really hard on whatever it is. It is so important to be able to share that with somebody and let them know that you see them and you see how resilient they are. And the 10th and last thing is kind of soft, but it's probably the absolute most important thing out of the things that you can do, which is to be kind. So again, when folks are living in a world that doesn't feel kind, legislatively, interpersonally, in their relationships, at school, at work, on the streets, everywhere, having somebody be kind to them can make a world of difference. Maybe more so than getting them connected to housing or getting them connected to a support group, but just literally having you be that kind person will make a big difference. So that is what I wanted to share with you all today. And I know we've got about 10 or so minutes left. And I think there's a couple of questions that have come in the chat. And let me flip my screen to my contact information. There you go. And so what kinds of questions do folks have? What kind of comments would people like to make?
So we've got a couple questions in the chat. This first one, I definitely can see being a big question for, especially in the South. What do you say when you want to say yes, ma'am, or yes, sir, out of respect? Because that's what I was taught growing up and teaching my children, and their pronoun is they, them, and their, or their.
That is really hard, right? And it's a question that I don't have a firm answer to. It's kind of relational. So who are you talking to? Who do you want to say sir or ma'am to? And there are other words. I would encourage you to Google some, because there are some different things that we can say to people. I'm blacking on some answers right now, which is really horrible. But there are other ways of showing people respect without using those two words. We can address people by their last name. And again, obviously using Mr. is a challenge too. It's a gendered language. But there can be some forms of respect that are not casual. In casual settings, we can use y'all, we can use you guys, which is kind of a Midwestern thing. I want to get back to you, and I'm sorry that I don't have a solid answer for you, but I hear that that's a challenge. And we may need to start changing our language a little bit to be more open.
For our next question, what do you have as reasons or explanations for why there is a greater number of intimate partner and sexual violence in the trans community?
We don't have scientific data as to why, but there are a couple of reasons why that might be. So sometimes, specifically around sexual violence within an intimate partner violence relationship, there's a belief that this is as good as it's going to get. So I have to tolerate the abusive behavior. Strangely enough, a lot of trans women feel that to be a woman, part of being a woman is being assaulted. And that's a really kind of warped way of thinking, but it almost feels for some trans women that it's validating their femininity because they think that women are supposed to be abused. So I think that some of that sets it up. Some of the street economy certainly sets up increased rates of violence, whether it's sexual violence or any other form of violence. I think a lot of it, though, is that many trans folks for IPV don't have models of what a healthy relationship looks like. If they can't see themselves in healthy relationship education, if that's happening at school at all, they may not know how to bring that into their own relationships. So that can be part of the reason. And we do live in a transphobic and a homophobic and a biphobic world. So a lot of times trans people can be seen as vulnerable. And I don't necessarily believe that, but if somebody else, a perpetrator, is seeing them as vulnerable, it may be more likely that they will be abused or assaulted by that person. There are many other reasons, but those are a handful of some of why.
Is there a resource list of safe zone agencies across the country or in specific areas?
That's a really good question. I bet Google will find the answer for us. I don't know offhand what the answer is for that. I think there might be, though. I don't know. Sorry that I don't know that.
And for the last question, will you make your slides available? Which, yes, they will be available. They will be mailed out. They will be emailed to you along with the survey. You'll be able to get access to them. And also, would you be willing to speak to a group with a private Zoom?
Of course. Of course, to the second one. And that goes for anybody. We love to work with folks, whether they're public and open events, whether they're private events, really focused on very narrow slices of issues or broadly focused. So yes, please feel free to reach out to me and I will be happy to get back to you for either me or someone else on my staff to work with you. What other things are people thinking about? What else got stirred up for folks that you'd like to have conversation about or some feedback on? And if there aren't more questions, I'd like to go back a slide and ask you another question instead of the other way around. So I'd love it again if, as we close out today, before we close out, and I know Brooke is going to share a couple of words at the end, in the chat, again, would you be willing to think about what is one small thing that you'll do today or tomorrow that will improve trans and non-binary survivors' lives? So it could be one of those 10 things that we just talked about. It could be one of those things on that mind map that we did. But what is one thing that you're committed to doing today or tomorrow or this week to improve trans people's lives? Yay for pride flags in offices. You can even get them at Target now, which is amazing.
Michael, we have another question. Sorry. Okay. We have a quick question. How would you navigate working with teen trans survivors whose parent is not supportive of their chosen identity?
That's a good question. It kind of depends on what services are being provided. Depends on if it's a mandatory reporting situation. Almost always we can get that youth in one-on-one conversation without the parents in the room, hopefully, and we can show respect to that teen and ask that person, that young person, how they would like us to handle it. Not to make them educate us, but like we want to respect what they want and where they want it around their parents, like what name and pronoun to use. But we can personally support them if we can have those moments with them, or we can have a signal that if we're in a room that's with their parents and with us as an advocate or whatever our role is, that we can, I don't want to do the Carol Burnett pulling on the ear thing, but we can try to make a signal or a sign that we can say, I got you. I know it's hard. And that's a really simple answer to a thing that is really complicated. Does it get partially at the question that you were asking? And if it doesn't, please ask again or ask differently.
Yes, that helps.
Great, cool. And I'm seeing a whole bunch of things in the chat, and I hope that you're all reading it too, of what some of the things are that people can do, like changing your signature file in your email, showing empathy, talking to your supervisor about office signage, including pronoun on application forms. Yeah, all of those things. So I'd really like you to think today about, today and beyond today, about what are those little things, because sometimes almost all of them are free, and almost all of them are really easy to do. And they can make a really huge difference. So again, thinking about things like kindness, things like using people's pronouns, having empathy, trying to find creative ways of working with like that trans or non-binary youth, coming up with other words for sir or ma'am, coming up with some other forms of respect. All of those things make a difference, make a big difference. And I'm just looking at hopefully again, all of you are reading the chat and seeing what some of the folks are saying that they do, so that you can get some other ideas from them.
Thank you so much, Michael, for being with us today. This was so much great information. Thank you to all of our attendees for being really engaged in the chat box, and that mind map was awesome to see all those responses come in. So yes, as Michael said, we will share the PowerPoint and the mind map with y'all after this presentation. Watch your email for the webinar evaluation. Once you complete that, you'll receive your accreditation certificate and handouts. And this recording, the recording of this webinar will also be posted on ICCR's website in the next few days. So thank you all again for being here and for prioritizing making the world a more welcoming and inclusive place for our trans community. And I hope everyone has a great weekend and a happy rest of Pride Month.
Thank you everybody for being here. Good to be with y'all.
Thank you.